The morning Patrick Dunlap rode into Harlan Creek, Wyoming territory in the spring of 1882, the first thing old Gus Fielder said to him at the livery stable was not hello, not welcome, and not anything resembling common courtesy. It was a warning. "You see that north claim up past the ridge line?" Gus said, not even looking up from the horseshoe he was hammering, sparks flying off the anvil like tiny orange stars in the dim light of the barn. "The one with the blue curtains in the window, and the most level fence line you ever saw on a homestead this side of the Powder River." Patrick had just swung down from his roan gelding, a fine animal named Copper that had carried him 700 miles from Missouri without complaint. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that had gotten long on the trail and a jaw that needed a razor badly. He said, "I wasn't looking at anything in particular. I just rode in." "Well, you look at it," Gus said, setting the horseshoe down with a clang. "Every man who rides through this territory eventually looks at it. And every single one of those men has tried his luck with the widow who runs that claim. And every single one of those men has either ridden away with his tail between his legs or just plain given up and left the territory entirely." Patrick patted Copper's neck and started loosening the saddle cinch. He was tired from the road, hungry, and not particularly interested in widows or warnings. He had come to Wyoming territory to buy land and start over, plain and simple. He had left behind a failed cattle operation in Missouri, a business partner who had cheated him out of 2 years of work, and a general sense that his life had been heading in the wrong direction for long enough. Wyoming was supposed to be a new start. He had money enough saved to make a down payment on a decent parcel, and he had skills enough to build something worth having. "What happened to her husband?" Patrick asked, more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. "Fever," Gus said. 3 years back, Thomas Conley was a decent man, not a great farmer, truth be told, but decent. She was already the better rancher of the two by the time he got sick. When he died, most folks figured she'd sell the claim and move back east to her family. Instead, she filed all the paperwork herself, hired 2 hands for the spring, built a new chicken coop, extended the vegetable garden, dug a second well, repaired the barn roof, and had the most productive wheat harvest of anyone in this valley come August. Gus paused, picked up his hammer again, and looked at Patrick for the first time. "She will outlast every man in this territory, son. Mark my words." Patrick Dunlap looked out through the open barn door toward the ridge line in the distance. The Wyoming sky was enormous above it, blue and swept with high white clouds, and somewhere up there past that ridge was a woman who ran a claim by herself and apparently terrified every man who met her. He took Copper's reins and walked him to a stall, settled the horse with water and feed, and then he went to find the land office to ask about available parcels. But the whole time he was walking down the main street of Harlan Creek, past the general store and the telegraph office and the small church with the crooked steeple, he kept thinking about blue curtains and a level fence line. He told himself it was just curiosity. He told himself he was a practical man with practical concerns, and widows who outlasted everyone were none of his business. He found the land office, spoke with the agent, looked at 3 plat maps, and confirmed that yes, there was available land to the south of town that might suit his purposes. He was supposed to ride out and look at it in the morning. That evening, he sat in the Harlan Creek saloon eating a plate of beans and bread and listening to the other men talk. It did not take long before the widow came up in conversation again, because apparently the widow always came up in conversation in Harlan Creek. "Rebecca Conley turned down Hector Price last week," said a lean man with a brown mustache. "Said she wasn't interested and asked him please not to come back unless he had legitimate cattle business." "That's the 4th man this year," said another. "Price, before him was that surveyor fellow, and before him was young Clayton, who everybody knew was too young anyway." "She's not going to marry again," said a third man, shaking his head with what seemed like genuine sorrow. "She's too independent. Most men can't handle a woman who knows more about running a ranch than they do." Patrick ate his beans and said nothing. He was not the type to join conversations he hadn't been invited into. But he filed everything away, the way he always did, quietly and methodically, because information about the place you were settling into was always worth having. He slept that night in the small boarding house above the hardware store, in a narrow bed that was nonetheless clean and comfortable, and he fell asleep thinking about the South Parcel and the logistics of a cattle operation versus wheat, and somewhere in between those practical thoughts was the image of a fence line so level it had impressed a man who had been shoeing horses long enough to have seen everything. He rode out to look at the South Parcel in the morning, as planned. The land was adequate. Not remarkable, not poor. The soil had potential, the creek access was reasonable, and the price was fair. He spent 2 hours walking the boundaries and taking measurements in his head, and he was 90% certain he was going to buy it. Then he rode back toward town the long way, because he wanted to see the shape of the valley, and the long way took him past the North Ridge. He did not plan to stop. He was simply looking at the landscape, the way a man who intended to live somewhere looked at it, learning the lay of the land, the direction of the prevailing wind, the way the water ran downhill and where it likely pooled. And then he came over the ridge and saw the North Claim spread out below him in the morning light, and he stopped Copper without really deciding to. The fence was, in fact, the straightest, most carefully maintained fence line he had ever seen on a private homestead. The posts were evenly spaced, the wire pulled taut, the corners anchored with what looked like extremely well-engineered braces. The barn was painted, which was not something you saw every day out here, a deep red that caught the morning sun beautifully. The house was modest but solid, with blue curtains in the windows exactly as Gus had said, and there was a kitchen garden along the south wall that was already showing green in the early spring. There was a well that looked new, maybe 2 years old at most, and beside it a pump that was a better model than the one the boarding house had. And there in the yard, mending a section of fence near the gate, was a woman. She was wearing work clothes, practical and unadorned brown trousers tucked into boots, a blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled past her elbows, and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face. She was working with the kind of focused efficiency that Patrick recognized immediately because he worked the same way himself. Every motion served a purpose. There was no wasted effort, no hesitation. She knew exactly what she was doing. He should have ridden on. He knew it. He had no business stopping at a woman's gate without an introduction or an invitation. But then she looked up because she had heard Copper's hooves, and Patrick saw her face for the first time. Rebecca Conley was 34 years old, and she had the kind of face that the territory had shaped into something remarkable. A high, clear brow, dark brown eyes that were sharp and direct, a mouth that looked like it knew how to be serious and how to laugh with equal facility, and color in her cheeks from working outdoors that no amount of fashionable pallor could have improved upon. She was not beautiful in the way that meant delicate. She was beautiful in the way that meant real. She looked at him without particular alarm and without particular welcome, just a straightforward assessment that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. "You're on the road," she said. "You're fine. But if you're stopping to talk, I'll ask you to state your business." Patrick took off his hat because his mother had raised him with manners regardless of circumstances. "Patrick Dunlap," he said. "I rode in from Harlan Creek. I was looking at the valley." "Looking at the valley," she repeated, with just a slight shift of tone that told him she had heard that particular opening before and was not especially impressed by it. "Are you the man from Missouri who was at the land office yesterday?" He blinked. "Word travels. Mr. Harding at the land office mentioned a buyer had come in. There aren't so many people in this valley that new arrivals go unnoticed." She went back to the fence, assessing the section she'd been working on, pressing one of the wires to test its tension. "The South Parcel is decent land. The soil is thin on the eastern edge, but the rest is workable." "That's about what I concluded," Patrick said. He was still on horseback, still at the road, which was the correct position for a stranger addressing a woman alone on her property. "You know that parcel?" "I know all the land in this valley. I've been here 9 years. She pulled a wire tool from her belt and made an adjustment to the post. Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Dunlap? Because if you've come with a proposition of any other kind, I'll save us both the time and tell you I'm not interested. It was the most direct preemptive refusal he had ever received for a question he hadn't asked yet, and despite himself, he almost smiled. No proposition, he said. Genuine curiosity about the land, and you have the best fence I've seen in the territory. She stopped working and looked at him again. Something changed slightly in her expression, not warmth exactly, but something less guarded. The corner bracing, she said, almost to herself. Most people put in one diagonal brace. I use a tension brace with 2 angle posts. That's what I thought, he said. Keeps the wire load from torquing the corner post out of plumb. She studied him for a moment. Most men who ride up here want to talk about themselves. I've got better things to talk about than myself. There was a pause that felt like it had some weight to it. Then Rebecca Conley went back to her fence. The south parcel will need work on the northern drainage before you put any structures in, she said, in the tone of a woman offering practical information to a neighbor, nothing more, nothing less. Water pools there in spring melt. You'll want to cut a swale before you break ground. Thank you, Patrick said, and he meant it, and something in the way he said it made her look up one more time. Good day, Mr. Dunlap, she said. He put his hat back on and rode toward town with the sound of those 2 words following him down the ridge like something he hadn't been expecting to feel. He bought the south parcel 3 days later. He told himself it was because the land was the right price and the right potential, which was true. He told himself it had nothing to do with the fact that from the high ground on his own property on a clear day, he could see the red barn on the north claim catching the light across the valley. And that was mostly a lie. The first weeks on the south parcel were brutal and wonderful in equal measure. Patrick had always been the kind of man who could lose himself in physical work and come out the other side of it feeling more like himself than when he had started. He set up a canvas tent as a temporary shelter, dug the drainage swale exactly where Rebecca Conley had told him to. And the woman had been absolutely right. Because when the late spring rains came, the water ran neatly off to the east instead of pooling against what would have been his foundation, and began cutting timber for the frame of a proper structure. He hired a man named Emilio Vasquez, who had been working odd jobs around the valley since the previous fall when the cattle drive he had come up from New Mexico on had ended. Emilio was 28, quiet, capable, and an exceptionally good carpenter, who had learned the trade from his father in Santa Fe. He had a gift for the fitting of joints that Patrick admired enormously. Together they worked from first light to last light most days, and the house frame went up faster than Patrick had estimated. The valley had a rhythm to it that Patrick began to learn the way you learn the rhythm of a person you will know for a long time, not all at once, but gradually, in accumulated small observations. He learned where the wind shifted in the afternoons and how to read the clouds coming over the northern peaks for weather. He learned which of his neighbors were worth the ride to their gate for a conversation and which were best left to their own devices. He learned that Harlan Creek was a town with enough life in it to be useful and enough quiet to be livable, which was exactly the balance he had been looking for. He also, over the course of those weeks, encountered Rebecca Conley 3 more times, once at the general store in town, where they both happened to be buying supplies on the same Tuesday morning, once at the spring community gathering that the settlement families held on the 1st of each month to share information about land and water and any trouble that had been reported, and once when her 2 ranch hands, brothers named Wade and Henry Birch, brought over a spare auger she had heard Patrick was in need of through some chain of valley communication that he never quite tracked to its source. Each encounter taught him something more about her. At the general store, he saw her negotiate with the proprietor over the price of a bolt of canvas with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly what fair market value was and would not accept anything less, but who did so without aggression or unkindness. She simply had the facts, stated them, and waited. She got the price she wanted. At the community gathering, he watched her speak about water rights with the same authority she brought to everything, presenting a logical case for a shared irrigation schedule that would benefit 3 downstream properties, including her own, but also including 2 families who could not have benefited her in any material way. She did it because it was the right solution. When one of the older landowners pushed back with the kind of skepticism that had more to do with the fact that she was a woman than with any flaw in her argument, she answered his every objection with a patience that Patrick found frankly remarkable, and in the end, the schedule was adopted. When Wade and Henry Birch arrived with the auger, they mentioned in passing that their employer had also sent along a note. It was a single page of neat, precise handwriting that listed the soil composition observations she had made on the eastern edge of his property line when she had ridden the fence with her own land the previous year. Just information, given freely, with a brief line at the bottom that said simply, "This may be useful, or can lie." Patrick read that note 4 times. He was not sure why. The information was genuinely useful. She was right about the clay content in the soil on that eastern strip. But that was not why he read it 4 times. He read it 4 times because the handwriting was like the woman, precise, unornamented, and with an underlying quality that suggested there was more behind it than the surface showed. He wrote back. He kept the note brief and professional, thanking her for the soil information and mentioning that he had confirmed her observations with his own assessment. He added one line at the bottom. "Your drainage advice on the swale saved me a significant problem. I owe you a good turn when the opportunity presents itself. P. Dunlap." Wade Birch collected his return note when he happened to ride past Patrick's work site the next morning. Patrick told himself it was just neighborly correspondence. The good turn presented itself sooner than expected. On the last Friday of May, Patrick was coming back from town in the early evening with supplies loaded in a wagon when he came over the North Ridge Road and saw smoke. Not house fire smoke, the wrong color and the wrong volume for that, but something was clearly burning on the Conley claim. He turned the wagon without thinking and drove down the track to her gate. The source of the smoke was clear when he got close enough to see. One of her outbuildings, a small hay storage structure built against the north side of her barn, had caught. The fire had not yet jumped to the main barn, but the space between them was narrow, and the dry spring air was moving in the wrong direction. Rebecca was already at the water pump with a bucket brigade organized herself. Wade and Henry working in a line with the speed and focus of people who had thought through the scenario in advance. But 3 people and a single pump were not going to be enough fast enough. Patrick was down from the wagon and at the pump before he had made a conscious decision to be there. He took the pump handle from Wade, who was flagging, and worked it with his full weight and strength. Copper was still in the traces, and Patrick told Wade in 2 words to take the second team from his wagon and get them away from the fire, and Wade, to his credit, understood immediately and moved. The 3 of them, Patrick, Rebecca, and Henry, worked the line hard for 20 minutes. Patrick pumped, Henry carried, Rebecca threw, and then they rotated and they rotated again, and the fire in the hay shed went from a threat to a manageable blaze to a containable burn, to a pile of smoking ruins that had, critically, not taken the barn with it. When it was over, the sun was going down and all 3 of them were covered in smoke and sweat and grime, and Henry Birch sat down in the dirt with his hands on his knees and breathed. Rebecca walked the perimeter of the barn, checking every timber for heat and ember, not resting until she was satisfied. Patrick stood at the pump and drank 3 cups of water from the bucket and watched her do it. When she came back to the yard and was finally satisfied, she looked at him directly. Her hat was gone somewhere, lost in the work, and her hair had come partly loose from its pins. In the last orange light of the evening she looked tired and strong and somewhat singed, and Patrick thought she was one of the most capable people he had ever seen. "Thank you," she said. It was simple and direct the way she was. I saw the smoke from the ridge road, he said. You had it organized. I just added hands. You added what was needed, she said. The barn would have gone if you hadn't been on that road at that moment. She paused. You said you owed me a good turn. Debt paid, he said. She looked at him for a moment, and then she did something he had not seen her do before. She smiled. Not a small, polite smile, but a real one, and it changed her face in the same way sunrise changes a landscape. Everything was the same, and everything was different. Debt paid, she agreed. And then she looked at the ruined hay shed, and her expression became practical again. I'll need to rebuild that before the next cutting. I have a carpenter, Patrick said. Emilio Vasquez. He's the best I've ever worked with. When we're through with the main structure on my place, I'd be glad to bring him over if you'd like. She looked at him with that direct, assessing quality he was getting to know. I pay fair wages. He'd expect nothing less. Another pause. I'll make supper, she said, not as an invitation so much as a statement that this was what was going to happen next. You and Henry should eat before you ride home in the dark. It was the first time Patrick Dunlap sat at Rebecca Conley's kitchen table, and it was nothing like what the stories in Harlan Creek had prepared him to expect, which was probably appropriate because most of the stories in Harlan Creek had been told by men who had never gotten past her front gate. The kitchen was neat and warm and smelled of wood smoke, and the supper she put together from what she had: beans, preserved beef, biscuits she made from scratch in the time it took Henry to wash his face and hands at the outside basin, and a pot of coffee that was strong enough to make Patrick's eyes fully open for the first time in hours. On the shelf above the stove were 3 books: a farmer's almanac from the previous year, a medical reference volume, and a slim volume of poetry that he noticed but did not comment on. On the wall near the window was a framed map of the valley that she had drawn herself, he realized, because the detail was too precise and too personal for anything available commercially. You drew that map, he said. She glanced at it from where she was stirring the pot. When I first arrived, Thomas and I walked every acre of this valley before we filed the claim. I drew what I saw as we went. A pause. It keeps my memory of that time honest. He understood what she meant and did not push it further, because you did not push Rebecca Conley on things she had given you only a piece of. But he felt the weight of it, the fact that the map was both a practical tool and a monument to something she had loved and lost, hanging on the kitchen wall where she could see it every day. Henry ate quickly and excused himself to check the horses and then did not come back in, which Patrick suspected was deliberate. He was alone with Rebecca at the table, and the lamp between them made the room feel smaller and warmer, and they talked. They talked about the land first. About the clay soil and the spring drainage patterns, and whether the northern peaks were getting less snow than they had 10 years ago, which both of them had heard from longer residents, and which both of them believed was probably true. They talked about wheat versus cattle, which was a practical argument with merits on both sides that Patrick had been turning over in his own head for weeks. She raised wheat and kept a small cattle herd for her own use, and she made the case for wheat with the specific logic of a woman who had watched the territory's markets develop closely. And then, because it was evening and they had done difficult physical work together, and there was good coffee and a lamp between them, the conversation became less strictly practical. Why Wyoming? She asked. Not unkindly, but she had the kind of mind that needed to understand the full context of a person. He told her about Missouri, about the partner who had cheated him, and he told it plainly without excessive bitterness, because the bitterness had mostly burned itself out on the 700-mile ride west. He told her about the cattle he'd had and lost, about the land that had been promising and gone wrong, about the general accumulation of failures that had brought him to a point where starting over entirely was not giving up, but was in fact the most sensible and brave thing he could do. He was surprised at himself for telling her all of it, but she listened without judgment, and without that particular kind of sympathy that was really pity, and he found it made the telling easier. Thomas and I came here from Ohio, she said after a moment. His idea, but I was ready to go. I'd grown up on a farm and I knew I wanted land of my own, proper land, not just a kitchen garden. He was enthusiastic about it, but not, she chose her words carefully, not particularly detail-oriented. The paperwork, the planning, the soil analysis. That fell to me and I was glad to do it. He was good at other things. He was very good at making me laugh. He sounds like someone worth remembering, Patrick said quietly. He was, she said, in a tone that was final and clear and not at all sad in the way that needed comfort, but was sad in the way that real loss is, which is to say permanent and understood and carried with dignity. I don't plan to marry again. I want you to know that, since you're a neighbor and we'll be in each other's company regularly, and I think it's better to be plain. Patrick looked at his coffee cup. Appreciated, he said. Most men hear that and take it as a challenge, she said, with a slight, dry edge to her voice. Most men are foolish about women who are smarter than them, Patrick said. She looked at him with something startled in her eyes and then she laughed. It was a genuine laugh, warm and real, and it was, Patrick thought, one of the finest sounds he had heard in the Wyoming territory so far. He left shortly after, in the blue dark of the late evening, riding Copper back over the ridge with the sounds of the burned hay shed still in his nostrils, and the sound of her laugh somewhere in the back of his mind where it had no business being. June came in hot and clear. Patrick's house came up fast with Emilio's skill and his own consistent labor. By the middle of the month it had walls and a roof, nothing finished or comfortable inside yet but structurally sound and weathertight, which was what mattered first. He moved out of the canvas tent and into the bare bones of the house and felt, for the first time since Missouri, that he was standing on something real. True to his offer, he sent Emilio over to the Conley claim once the main structure was framed. Emilio spent 2 weeks there rebuilding the hay shed, and he came back each evening with observations about the North claim that he shared with Patrick in the natural course of conversation, with no apparent awareness that Patrick was listening with a particular attention. "She's a serious worker," Emilio said one evening, eating supper at Patrick's camp table inside the unfinished house. "Better than any of the ranch owners I worked for in New Mexico. She has a plan for everything. Even the chickens are on a system." "The chickens," Patrick said. "She has which hens are the best layers marked with different colored leg bands. She knows the production of each individual bird. This is a woman who understands organization." Patrick smiled at his supper plate. "That doesn't surprise me." Emilio glanced at him with the expression of a man who was young but not blind. "She talks about you sometimes," he said carefully. "Practical things, about the south parcel. She seems to think highly of the drainage work you did." Patrick did not say anything to that. But that night he lay in his unfinished house looking up at the solid roof he'd built with his own hands and thought about a woman who kept records on which chickens were her best layers, and he was deeply, hopelessly charmed. He saw her at the community gathering in June, and she sat across the table from him instead of at the other end, which was a small geographical change that nonetheless felt significant. They argued amicably about crop rotation, and both came away from the argument having changed their position slightly, which was the best kind of argument. He saw her at the general store again, and this time she stayed to talk for 20 minutes about a water access dispute 2 properties over that she thought would come to a head before summer's end if someone didn't mediate it carefully. She was right about that too, as it turned out. He rode over to the North Claim twice in June on legitimate business. Once to return a set of fence pliers that had somehow ended up in his wagon after the fire, and once when he heard from the Birch brothers that her pump head had cracked, and he happened to have a spare of the same model that he hadn't installed yet. Both times she received him at the yard. Both times the conversation lasted longer than the ostensible purpose required, and both times when he rode back home in the evening, he felt the absence of her company as a distinct and specific lack. He was falling in love with her, and he knew it. He knew it the way you know something you have been trying not to look at directly, gradually at first, and then all at once. And once you have looked directly at it, you cannot stop seeing it. He was also deeply respectful of what she had told him at that first kitchen supper. She was not interested in marrying again, she had said, and she had meant it. She was not a woman who said things without meaning them. He turned this over in his mind with considerable frequency, and came to no particular conclusion except that he would not push, and he would not be one of the men who took no for a challenge. If she changed her mind, it would be because she had arrived there herself. He could only be what he was and let that speak, or not speak, as it would. The water access dispute she had predicted came to a head in late July, and it was messier than anticipated. The disputing parties were the Harmon family on the eastern floodplain, and a newer settler named Cole Draper, who had filed a claim upstream 6 months earlier, and had quietly been diverting more water than his rights allowed. By the time Patrick heard the full story from Wade Birch, Amos Harmon had ridden to Draper's property, and there had been an exchange of words that had nearly become something worse, and the whole valley was on edge about it. Rebecca called an informal meeting at her property. This was not part of any official structure, but was simply the kind of thing she did. She saw a problem that needed addressing, she assessed who needed to be in the room, and she arranged for them to be there. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Patrick rode over with half a dozen other valley landowners to find coffee and a plain-spoken agenda already waiting. She laid out the water rights as she understood them from the original county filings, which she had clearly spent time researching carefully. She was precise about what Draper was legally entitled to and what he was not, and she was equally precise about what the downstream properties were entitled to. She did not accuse Draper of anything. She simply stated the documented facts in a tone that left no room for ambiguity. Draper, a compact and red-faced man in his 40s who had clearly come to the meeting expecting a fight, found himself confronted with documentation that outmaneuvered any aggression he had planned. Patrick watched her run that meeting from the corner of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and he felt something in his chest that was not just admiration, though it was certainly that. The outcome was an agreed schedule that had Draper reducing his upstream diversion to his legal share, with a 6-week window to make the necessary changes to his intake structure. Amos Harmon was satisfied. The valley relaxed. Rebecca accepted quiet thanks from the assembled landowners with brisk, practical grace and sent everyone home with the afternoon still usable. As people were filing out, Patrick hung back. He was not sure entirely why. She was gathering the papers from the table, stacking them with her characteristic efficiency, and he said, "That was well done." She looked up. It was only fair, stated plainly. Most disputes about water in this territory don't get resolved that peacefully, he said. You may have saved someone from getting hurt. She was quiet for a moment, looking down at the papers in her hand. Then she said something he was not expecting. Thomas would have hated every minute of this sort of thing. He was not a man who liked conflict, even managed conflict. He would have found some reason to leave early. There was no criticism in it, just memory, honest and unvarnished. I don't mind it. I find that the facts presented correctly do most of the work. Where did you learn to think that way? Patrick asked. She looked at him with slight surprise, as if the question was not one she had been asked before. My mother, she said after a moment. She was the most logical person I knew. She managed everything, the farm, the accounts, my father's affairs when his health failed, and she always said that emotion was useful information, but it was not a decision-making tool. She paused. I respected that. I've tried to live by it. It shows, Patrick said. And then, because they were alone in the room, and the afternoon light was coming through the blue curtains, and she was looking at him with those dark, direct eyes, he said something he had not entirely planned to say. She must be proud of what you've built here. Rebecca's expression shifted in a way he could not fully read, complicated, private, and then returned to something more composed. She died 4 years ago, she said. She never saw this place. Patrick held her gaze and said, I think she would have known, regardless. The silence in the room lasted exactly long enough to become something other than just silence. And then Rebecca set her papers down very deliberately and said, in a voice that was careful but not unkind, "Patrick." It was the first time she had used his first name. He waited. "I told you in June that I had no intention of marrying again," she said. "You did," he agreed. "I stand by that as my position," she said. "But I find," she stopped, chose again, "I find that I enjoy your company more than I have enjoyed anyone's company in a long time. And I want to be honest with you about that because I think you deserve honesty, and because I think you are one of the few men I've met in this valley who is capable of receiving it without it becoming something it isn't." Patrick looked at her for a long moment. Outside, he could hear horses moving away down the track as the last of the meeting attendees rode home. The summer afternoon was golden and enormous around the small frame of the house. "Rebecca," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name either, "I will take honesty from you over any other thing, and I won't ask for more than what you're willing to give." She held his gaze for a breath. "Good," she said, and she picked up her papers again and walked to the shelf to file them, and the moment closed, but it closed differently than before. August was the hardest working month either of them had, and paradoxically the one in which they spent the most time in each other's company. Patrick's south parcel went into a late-season wheat planting. He had decided on wheat, partly on her advice, and partly on his own analysis of the market, and the decision had required an enormous amount of ground preparation that he and Emilio worked through in 12-hour days for 3 weeks. Rebecca's wheat harvest was the same period, and between his ground preparation and her harvest, there was a natural exchange of labor and equipment that had them working side by side or in adjacent fields for days at a stretch, with the Birch brothers and Emilio moving between operations as needed. There was something deeply satisfying about working alongside someone who had the same ethic and the same standards. Patrick had worked with many people over the years, and he knew the rare pleasure of a partner whose rhythm matched your own, who didn't need to be told twice, who kept their head in difficult moments and their humor in exhausting ones. Rebecca was all of those things. She was also funny when she chose to be, which caught him off guard every time because her humor was dry and precise and came at unexpected moments. The first time he laughed at one of her observations, he was so surprised by the depth of his own laughter that he had to stop walking for a moment, and she looked at him with a quietly satisfied expression that he suspected she wore when she had gotten a calculation exactly right. They fell into a habit that wasn't quite a courtship but was undeniably something. On evenings when the work had been shared, she would make supper, and on other evenings he would bring food over to her kitchen, and they would sit at that table with the lamp between them and talk until the late dark outside the blue curtains made it clear that he needed to ride home. The conversations covered everything land and weather and the broader politics of the territory, the ongoing question of Wyoming statehood that everyone in Harlan Creek had a strong opinion about, books he had read and she had read, the particular quality of the night sky in this valley that was different from any sky either of them had seen before. She was reading her way through a collection of scientific texts that had arrived from an Eastern bookseller by mail order, a subject that delighted him because his own reading had run largely in that direction, and there was no one in Harlan Creek he had been able to discuss it with. They spent an entire evening arguing pleasurably about the merits of a particular geological theory, and he rode home at midnight feeling as if his mind had been stretched and aired out like a room that had been closed too long. One evening in late August, after a day of particularly hard harvest work, they sat on her porch steps instead of at the kitchen table because neither of them could summon the energy to go inside. The valley was dark below them, and the stars above the peaks were the extravagant, unhurried stars of the high country. She had a blanket around her shoulders because the evenings had begun to cool, and she was holding a cup of coffee and looking at the sky with an expression that was purely contemplative, not performing contentment but actually feeling it. "I have not sat still this willingly in 2 years," she said. "Hard not to, under stars like that," he said. She leaned her head back and traced something in the sky with her eyes. He watched her profile against the stars, which was not something he had any right to be doing, but was something he found himself unable to stop. She was, he thought, the most interesting person he had ever known. Not just the most interesting woman, the most interesting person. There was something in her that was continuously surprising, which was the finest quality a person could have. She lowered her head and found him looking at her, and she did not look away. "I said I would be honest with you," she said. "You have been," he said. "I find that my previous position on the matter of—" She paused, and there was something in the pause that was not her customary certainty, but was instead the sound of a very careful person considering something important on the matter of marriage, "has become somewhat more complicated than when I stated it." Patrick was very still. "I don't say that as an invitation," she said immediately. "I say it because I promised you honesty, and denying what is clearly happening seems dishonest." "What is clearly happening?" he asked very quietly. She looked at him steadily, but there was something behind the steadiness that was soft, or at least the potential for soft, which on Rebecca Conley was as significant as outright tenderness would have been on anyone else. "I care for you," she said plainly. "I didn't intend to." "I know," he said. "It concerns me," she said. "I know that too." "I have everything organized the way I want it," she said, and there was something both funny and heartbreaking in the phrasing. "I know where everything is. I know what I can count on." "I don't—" She stopped. "You don't want to need anyone," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "That is perhaps the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in 3 years," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. Then he said, "I don't want to change what you've built. I don't want to take anything from you. I'm not—" He searched for the right words. "I'm not the kind of man who would try to organize your chickens, Rebecca." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "The chickens are on a very specific system." "I know," he said. "Emilio told me about the leg bands." She did laugh this time, real and warm, and then she was quiet, and the stars were enormous above them. And after a moment she said, with the careful deliberateness of someone making a decision that has been arrived at through thorough analysis and will not be reversed, "I think I would like you to court me properly, if you are willing." Patrick Dunlap, who had ridden 700 miles from Missouri and bought land and built a house and worked himself to honesty and waited without pressure, and been everything that he actually was without pretending to be anything else, looked at the woman beside him and said, "I have never been more willing for anything in my life." She nodded, in that practical way she had, as if something had been agreed upon and the next steps could now be planned. Then she leaned very slightly against his shoulder, just the smallest shift of weight, and looked back at the stars, and he did not move or speak because the moment was perfect, and he had the intelligence to let it be. The formal courtship of Patrick Dunlap and Rebecca Conley was, true to both of their natures, somewhat different from the typical arrangements of the territory. There were no chaperoned parlor visits, since they were both adults with properties to run, and neither of them had time for unnecessary formality. There were instead Sunday afternoons when he rode over and they rode the valley together on horseback, assessing fences and water levels and the general state of the land, which was also, not incidentally, time spent in each other's company doing what they both loved doing. There were evenings with books and conversation. There were shared tasks that became occasions, the mending of equipment and the planning of next season's planting, which became conversations about the future that gradually, over the weeks of autumn, began to include the words "we" and "our" in ways that both of them noticed and neither of them corrected. Harlan Creek noticed, of course. Harlan Creek had been watching Rebecca Conley reject men for 3 years and had a great deal of accumulated opinion on the subject. Patrick was aware of being assessed by every person he encountered in town, and he found it only slightly irritating, mostly because he understood it. She was valued here, genuinely valued, not just as a curiosity but as a person who had made the community better by being in it. They were protective of her. He respected that. Old Gus Fielder at the livery caught him one morning in September and said, with an air of someone delivering momentous news, "She's letting you court her." "So she is," Patrick said. Gus stared at him for a long moment. "I told you she'd outlast every man in this territory." "You did," Patrick agreed. "And you rode over anyway." "I did." Gus considered this for a while, hammering the same horseshoe he seemed to have been hammering when Patrick had first ridden in. Then he said, "Maybe outlasting everybody isn't the same as outlasting the right person." Patrick smiled and said, "That's a wise observation, Gus." Gus waved him off and went back to his anvil, but Patrick saw the old man smiling as he walked away. October turned the valley golden, and then copper, and then a deep, exhausted brown, and the work of the season shifted from harvest to preparation for winter. Patrick's house was now finished enough to be genuinely comfortable: plastered walls, a proper floor, a cast-iron stove that could heat the space efficiently, and curtains that he had bought at the general store in a blue that he had told himself was because it was a practical color, and told himself this story until the morning Rebecca walked into his house for the first time and looked at the curtains and looked at him, and he felt his ears go red. "Blue curtains," she said. "It was the color they had," he said. She said nothing else, but the corner of her mouth moved in the very specific way it moved when she was pleased about something and did not intend to make a production of it. He proposed to her on a Tuesday morning in November. He had planned to do it on a Sunday afternoon, properly, with forethought and the right words arranged carefully. And then Tuesday arrived, and they were mending fence together on the property line between their claims, which was something they had begun doing together, maintaining the shared boundary as a joint enterprise, which said everything about the nature of what they were building. And she said something about how the spring planting schedule would work better if they could share the use of the cedar. And he said it would be a lot simpler if it was just one operation. And she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the words he had planned for Sunday came out on Tuesday in the middle of a fence line. "Rebecca," he said, holding the wire stretcher in one hand because there was no pretense possible between them, "I want to marry you. I want to share this land and this work and every conversation I haven't had with you yet. I'm not asking you to change anything you've built. I'm asking to build alongside you." She was quiet for a long moment. Around them the November wind moved through the dry grass, cold and clear. The peaks to the north had new snow on them, white and precise against the blue sky. "You would have to accept," she said carefully, "that I keep my own counsel on how this land is managed." "I would not have it any other way," he said. "You know this land better than I do. You would have to accept that I will occasionally be right when you are wrong, and I expect that to be acknowledged. I expect the same courtesy from you," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "I am not always easy to live with," she said. "Neither am I," he said. She looked at him with those dark, direct eyes, and he saw in them everything that had been gradually accumulating since that first morning at the road. The care, the intelligence, the humor, the trust that she had extended to him so carefully and incrementally, and which he had tried his absolute best to deserve. He saw something else too, something that was not just practical consideration but was real and genuine and warm, the love of a woman who did not love easily or carelessly, and who had arrived at it through everything honest about herself. "Yes," she said, simply and directly, the way she did everything. He crossed the distance between them on that fence line, and took her face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her, and she kissed him back without reserve, and the Wyoming wind came across the ridge and moved through the grass around them, and the fence line between their properties stood straight and true. They were married in December, in the small church in Harlan Creek with the crooked steeple, on a morning when snow had fallen overnight and the whole valley was white and silent. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Aldrich, who was a practical man of God, well-suited to practical territory, and the witnesses were Emilio Vasquez and the Birch brothers and half of Harlan Creek, which had turned out in numbers that suggested the whole community had been waiting for this outcome more consciously than anyone had admitted. Gus Fielder sat in the third pew and cried, which surprised everyone who knew him, and which he denied for the remainder of his natural life. The wedding supper was held at Rebecca's house, their house now, and she had cooked most of it herself, helped by Emilio's unexpectedly excellent tamales and a cake that the minister's wife had contributed, and they sat around a table that was too small for the number of people who wanted to be around it, which was exactly the right kind of problem to have. Wade Birch made a toast that was brief and honest and somewhat gruff. "She's the best rancher in this territory," he said, raising his glass toward Rebecca, "and now maybe the territory will stop talking about it and let her get on with proving it for a few more decades." There was laughter and everyone drank, and Rebecca shook her head with the expression of a woman who was slightly embarrassed and entirely happy. Patrick made no formal toast. He simply put his hand over hers on the table, and she turned her hand and held his, and that was the whole speech. The winter of their first year of marriage was the winter Patrick came to fully understand what it meant to share a life with a person who was genuinely your equal. He had thought he understood this intellectually before the ceremony. He had not understood it in the bone, in the day-to-day reality of two people running a combined operation with different strengths and the same fundamental standards. She managed the books with a precision that made his previous accounting efforts look approximate at best. He discovered unsuspected talents in construction and equipment repair that she recruited shamelessly and unapologetically, which made him happy in a way he could not entirely explain. They argued with some regularity and resolved those arguments with remarkable efficiency, partly because both of them were too logical to let emotion run away with them, and partly because both of them had the same underlying goal, which made the path to agreement shorter than it might otherwise have been. She was also, and this was the thing that he had not fully anticipated, though in retrospect the evidence had always been there, unexpectedly tender. Not in public, not in performative ways, but in the private language of a shared life. The way she left his coffee exactly hot enough on the stove when she rose before him. The way she brought him the medical reference volume without comment when he came in from a fence repair with a gash on his forearm, and let him treat it himself while she sat nearby reading and occasionally telling him if he was doing it correctly. The way she laughed in the dark at the stories he told her about Missouri before he had learned what he was doing, when the stories were safe enough to be funny. The way she reached for his hand sometimes when they were watching the valley from the porch, not as a statement, just as a fact. He found, to his own slight amazement, that he had never been happier. Spring came, and with it the planting season for their combined operation, which they had formally consolidated under a single land holding with both names on the deed. Something the land agent in Harlan Creek had noted was unusually equitable for the era, but had processed without comment because Rebecca Conley was the sort of person who made unusual things seem entirely reasonable. They planted wheat on both parcels, with different varieties calibrated to the slightly different soil composition on the north and south sides of the valley. Patrick's drainage work on the south parcel, extended and improved over the winter, meant that both properties now had better water management than any comparable claims in the valley. Emilio Vasquez had by this point become effectively a permanent part of the operation, having proven himself so indispensable that Rebecca had offered him a long-term wage arrangement and a small bunkhouse that Patrick and he had built together over 3 winter weekends. Emilio accepted with the dignified gratitude of a man who had been looking for a place to belong for a long time and had found it. The Birch brothers remained on seasonal contracts, and the whole enterprise had the feeling of something that was growing into what it was meant to be. In July of their first year of marriage, Rebecca told Patrick she was pregnant. She told him at the kitchen table in the morning over coffee, in the same direct and unemotional tone she brought to all important information. Then she looked at him with something that was not unemotional at all behind those steady eyes, something that was complicated and private and waiting for his response. He got up from his side of the table and came around to hers and knelt beside her chair and put his hands over hers and said, "Are you well? Are you pleased? What do you need?" She looked at his face for a moment with an expression that he thought was one of the most unguarded he had ever seen from her. "I am well," she said. "I am, yes. Pleased is not the large enough word, but it will do for now. And I need nothing except for you to stop looking at me as if I am made of glass, because I am not." "You are not," he agreed, and kissed her, and she permitted this with more warmth than her practical tone had suggested. And outside the blue curtains the summer morning was enormous and golden. The pregnancy proceeded in the manner of most things Rebecca undertook, with thorough preparation, rigorous attention to the relevant information, and an utter refusal to be incapacitated by circumstances she considered manageable. She continued working her reasonable schedule through the summer and into the fall, modifying the physical demands as needed with a clear-eyed assessment of what was prudent. And she read every medical text she could obtain on the subject with the focus she brought to any area of knowledge she considered important. Patrick, for his part, was attentive without being overbearing, which was a balance he achieved through constant conscious effort, because his instinct was to do everything for her and her clear preference was to do things herself. He learned to offer rather than to presume, to be present without hovering, to channel his anxiety into useful preparation rather than anxious hovering. He built a cradle in the evenings, working carefully on the joinery because it needed to be exactly right, and Rebecca came out sometimes and sat in the chair near the workshop door and watched him work, which was as close as she came to acknowledging that she found it comforting. In late November, on a cold night when the snow was thick outside and the fire was burning in the main room, their son came into the world. He arrived with a great deal of energy and volume, which seemed appropriate. He had dark hair from his father and dark eyes from his mother, and an expression of immediate strong opinion that was entirely from both of them. They named him Thomas James Dunlap. Thomas for Rebecca's first husband and her mother's memory, which Patrick had suggested without prompting because he understood the map on the wall and what it meant, and James for Patrick's father, who had been the most honest man he had known. The combination seemed to them both to be correct. Rebecca held their son in the firelight and looked at him with an expression that was completely unlike any Patrick had seen on her face before, open and unguarded in a way that required no translation, fierce and tender at once. Everything she kept carefully organized and contained flowing directly from her without any management at all. She was looking at Thomas James Dunlap, and she was, Patrick understood, completely present in the way that only the most important moments of a life make possible. He sat beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him, not slightly this time but fully, with the weight of someone who has decided that this is a safe place to rest. "He looks fierce," Patrick said. "He should," Rebecca said. "He has work to do." Thomas was, as it turned out, a child of exceptional opinion and considerable stubbornness, which came from both sides of his inheritance in equal measure, and which his parents regarded with the amused recognition of people seeing their own qualities reflected in a new human being. He was also intelligent, curious, and loud, and the house on the combined Conley-Dunlap claim rang with a different kind of life than it had held before. The years that followed were not without difficulty, because no good life is. There was a drought year in which the wheat harvest was poor across the valley, and Patrick and Rebecca had to draw on their reserves more heavily than was comfortable. There was a spring when a respiratory illness ran through Harlan Creek, and Thomas spent 2 frightening weeks sick before recovering fully. And both Patrick and Rebecca spent those 2 weeks in a state of suppressed terror that they managed together, taking turns at the bedside, and at the practical work of the ranch, holding each other up by each holding their end. There were land disputes and market fluctuations, and the steady political turbulence of a territory working toward statehood, which finally arrived in 1890, when Wyoming became the 44th state of the Union, with a state constitution that notably included women's suffrage, a fact that Rebecca received with a controlled satisfaction that was the most expressive form of joy she publicly allowed herself, though in the privacy of their kitchen she said, "It should have always been thus." And Patrick agreed with her completely. She had also, quietly and over years, become one of the most respected voices in the valley on land and water rights. When the county organized its first agricultural board in the late 1880s, she was asked to serve on it, not merely permitted, which was the relevant distinction, and she did so with the same thorough, fact-based clarity she brought to everything. Patrick attended the board meetings as her husband and sat in the back, and watched her command a room of experienced landowners with the authority of someone who had simply always been right more often than anyone else. And he felt a pride in her that was different from any other pride he had felt about anything, deeper and more specific. Their daughter arrived 3 years after Thomas, in the winter of 1885, and was named Clara Ann. She had her mother's eyes and her father's laugh and her own particular quality that emerged early and was entirely hers. A musical instinct, an ear for pitch and rhythm that appeared out of nowhere, and that both parents traced to a grade aunt on Patrick's Missouri side who had apparently played piano with some skill. Clara's need for music in the household was met by a second-hand piano that arrived from Denver by freight wagon in the spring of 1887 and took up a significant portion of the main room, and which both Patrick and Rebecca considered entirely worth the space. Thomas, growing up in the practical and intellectually serious household of his parents, turned out to have an engineer's mind, a passion for how things worked, and a gift for improvement that first manifested in a redesigned irrigation channel he sketched out at the kitchen table when he was 12 and which, when Patrick actually had it built, worked better than the original. Rebecca looked at the completed channel, looked at her son, and said, with the most concise pride possible, "That's correct." Thomas ducked his head to hide that he was pleased, but he was not quick enough. The valley around them changed over those years, as the territory did. More settlers arrived and some departed. The town of Harlan Creek grew from its modest cluster of buildings into something that resembled a real town, with a school and a proper doctor, and eventually a telegraph office that connected it to the wider world in ways that felt, to Patrick's thinking, like both gain and loss in roughly equal measure. The school was the gain he cared most about, and both his children attended it from its first year of operation, and both of them came home each afternoon with more to say than the day before, which was exactly as it should be. Gus Fielder lived to 73 and kept his livery stable until the year before he died, when his hands became too unsteady for the precise work of fitting horseshoes. He closed the stable with something close to ceremony and retired to a small house on the south edge of town, and Patrick and Rebecca rode in to see him regularly until the end. On his last good day, he looked at both of them sitting in his small front room and said, with the satisfaction of a man who had predicted something correctly, "I told you she'd outlast every man in the territory." "You did," Patrick said. "And she has," Gus said, looking at Rebecca with genuine admiration. "Not outlasted," Rebecca said, in the particular dry tone she reserved for recalibrating loose language. "Outlasted implies they're all gone. Patrick is still here." Gus thought about this. "Well," he said, "maybe that one didn't count." Rebecca looked at Patrick with the particular expression, warm and private and specific to him alone, that she had developed over 15 years of shared life, and said, "No, that one counted most." The summer of 1896 was the hottest in 20 years, and the valley shimmered in August heat that made the air look liquid above the fields. Thomas was 14 and Clara 11, and both of them had grown into themselves in ways that were deeply satisfying to watch. Thomas with his engineer's exactness and his father's quiet steadiness, Clara with her mother's intelligence and her piano and her own fierce, particular way of being in the world. Patrick was 45 and Rebecca 48, and neither of them had slowed in any way that mattered, though they both felt the long years of physical work in their joints on cold mornings, which they acknowledged to each other with the brevity of people who have no time or interest in complaint. The ranch had expanded significantly from those first combined parcels. They had purchased 2 adjacent properties over the years as they became available, expanding the operation to a scale that required year-round hands and a proper bunkhouse, and a level of organizational complexity that Rebecca managed with the same systems-based precision she had brought to everything since her chicken leg band era. Emilio Vasquez had become, over the years, the best foreman in the county. He had also, in 1888, married a woman named Carmen who had come to the territory with her brother's family, and they had built a life on the Dunlap Conley land that was woven into the fabric of the whole enterprise. Patrick and Emilio had the kind of working friendship that is built on 15 years of difficult work done honestly together, and Rebecca had a genuine respect for Carmen that expressed itself in the way she expressed all genuine respect, which was through trusting her judgment on things that mattered. On that hot August evening in 1896, Patrick and Rebecca sat on the porch as they had done thousands of times, watching the dark come down over the valley. The peaks had gone purple against the last of the light, and the first stars were beginning to appear, and the grass below the ridge was dry and golden in the late summer way that always looked, from this angle, like the valley was lit from within. Thomas had gone to bed early because he had promised to ride to the eastern fence at first light. Clara was inside, playing something slow and gentle on the piano, and the sound of it came out through the open windows into the evening air and became part of the night in the way that music in a house where you have lived a long time becomes indistinguishable from the house itself. Rebecca's hand was in Patrick's. It had been in Patrick's hand on this porch on hundreds of evenings, and it never felt like routine, because there was nothing routine about the fact of her. There never had been, and he was fairly certain there never would be. She had surprised him at every stage of their life together with some new facet of herself, some new observation or capability or unexpected warmth, and he had come to think of this as one of the fundamental gifts of his life, the way she was inexhaustible in the ways that mattered. Emilio says the south field will come in above projection, she said. He told me the same, Patrick said. We should look at the eastern parcel in the spring. The soil analysis from the spring water suggests it could support a different crop rotation than we've been using. I thought the same thing last week. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. Clara's music drifted out and up into the evening air, something in a minor key that resolved gently into something easier. Are you happy? Patrick asked. She turned to look at him, which she did not always do immediately when he asked her questions, because she usually considered before she answered. But this time she turned at once, and in the last light he could see her face clearly, this face he had loved for 15 years, precise and warm and entirely itself. I didn't know this was what happiness was, she said. When I was young, I thought it was a feeling, some particular state that arrived. It isn't, it's this. She looked back at the valley, the work, the children, you, knowing where everything is and trusting that it will hold. Patrick looked out at the valley with her. Below them the ridge fell away to the dark fields, and the creek caught the starlight in one distant silver line, and their land lay in the dark in all directions, their wheat in the ground, their cattle in the north pasture, their son asleep inside and their daughter playing music, their hands and their friends in the bunkhouse, and the fence lined straight and true running out to the edges of what they had built. I rode over the day after Gus Fielder warned me about you, Patrick said, and he was smiling. I am so glad I did. She looked at him with that private, warm expression that was his, that had always been his, That was the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him. "You had to," she said simply. "I was never going to ride over to you." He laughed and she laughed, and Clara's music inside shifted to something brighter, as if she had heard, and the stars above the Wyoming Valley were vast and unhurried, and the night was warm, and everything that mattered was exactly where it was supposed to be. In the years that followed, Thomas James Dunlap did go east to study engineering, as his parents had encouraged and his abilities had earned. He returned to the territory afterward, because the land had shaped him as it had shaped both his parents, and he brought with him an engineering degree, and a wife named Eliza from Denver who had her own precise and capable way about her that made Rebecca nod with visible approval at their first meeting. Thomas and Eliza settled on the eastern parcel of the expanded Dunlap Conley operation, and Thomas began the irrigation improvements that would, over the following decade, make their combined holdings among the most productive in the county. Clara kept her music and eventually taught piano to the children of Harlan Creek from a studio in town, and she married a quiet, kind man named William Frost, who ran the hardware store, and who loved her with a steadiness that Patrick and Rebecca recognized immediately as the real thing. Their wedding was in June, a summer morning, and Rebecca danced at that wedding with a looseness and joy that Patrick had seen only in the most private of their private moments, and he watched her and felt the extraordinary luck of his life like a physical warmth in his chest. The Dunlap Conley Ranch, as it had come to be known throughout the county, passed into the next generation with everything intact and everything resolved. The deeds were clear, and the water rights were secure, and the fence lines, all of them, remained as straight and true as the woman who had first built them, because she had taught everyone who came after her that the quality of the work was the character of the person, and that both mattered absolutely. Rebecca Conley Dunlap lived to 81 years in the Wyoming Valley she had chosen when she was young and never left. And when she died, she left behind the most productive agricultural operation in the county, 2 children who were remarkable in their own right, 4 grandchildren, and the longest-running water rights agreement in the region, which was still in effect and still bore her name on the original documentation. She left behind a husband who had loved her for 47 years and who would grieve her for the rest of his life with the honest, uncomplaining grief of a man who had received more than he had ever asked for and knew it. She also left behind the map on the kitchen wall, the one she had drawn when she first arrived with Thomas Conley, that careful, detailed map of the valley, with every creek and ridge and property line noted in her precise handwriting. It stayed on that kitchen wall for 3 generations, through floods and droughts and the ordinary, extraordinary passage of time, and everyone who grew up in that house knew what it meant. That you should learn your place thoroughly, that you should pay attention, that you should build things to last, and that the people worth loving are the ones who understand the value of a level fence line. And everyone in Harlan Creek, Wyoming, remembered for a long time what old Gus Fielder had said on that first morning, before anyone knew how the story would go, that she would outlast every man in the territory. And what Patrick Dunlap had done in response, he had ridden over immediately, not to conquer or to try his luck, but because a man who has been told that a woman is extraordinary should always, always go and see for himself. He had seen. He had stayed. He had been the better for every single day of it. And that, when all was said and done, was the whole of the matter.